I think, very helpful. Is the particular, you know, I don't know that there is a scientific method, but the idea that scientists are very interested in collecting evidence and revising their hypotheses on the basis of that evidence. The best scientists are always self-critical in the sense that they are looking for, they're not just looking for the evidence to support their conclusion, they're looking for the evidence to challenge their conclusion. Now that I think anyone who's doing good reasoning is also doing. But again, science is sort of focused on, I suppose, if you will, the physical, material, empirical, kind of empirical world. Those terms, by the way, those terms are kind of hard to find, you know. I mean, science is also interested in things like gravity, which is not, you know, a thing quite like this, but it is nevertheless a thing that can be measured in certain kinds of ways. So I guess that would be my thought here. To think like a scientist is not just good reasoning in general, but it's good reasoning about the kinds of things that can be measured, quantified, manipulated, perhaps something like that.
Right.
Well, one thing I got to say is I teach accounting. And if you know anything about accounting, you know that it is actually a science. So you have one science-based person up here. And basically in my class, what I teach the students is keep everything organized, keep everything clean. That's how it works. So accounting is nothing more than separating all these complex transactions, intents, equipment into their own separate categories. And then as business goes on, we analyze from there. First part is making sure everything is clean so we can see exactly what's happening inside the books. I liken ourselves to something like Jedis. We have no intent whatsoever. If it goes out of business, if it succeeds, we don't care. All we want to know is, are the records clean? Is everything that happened in this business recorded somewhere where we can see it with an objective point of view? That's the most important thing, objectivity. Have any effect whatsoever on what's going on inside the business, except for recording the transactions as they are. Once you have that cleanliness, it flips over to the other side. That's what happened yesterday. Here's how we see it today. You use the past to think of what we can do tomorrow. If that advertising campaign resulted in more sales, if we increase that, will it result in even more? But it only works if you keep those records clean. So thinking like a scientist is, well, sort of like cleanliness. That's how I sort of think.
Okay, just to give you a fifth viewpoint here, I actually found a quote from Adam Grant from Greater Good magazine from March 21st, 2021. And here's what he says. Thinking like a scientist does not mean you need to own a telescope or a microscope. It just means that you favor humility over pride and curiosity over conviction. You know what you don't know, and you're eager to discover new things. You don't let your ideas become your identity. You look for reasons why you might be wrong, not just the reasons why you might be right. You listen to ideas that make you think hard, not just the ones that make you feel good. And you surround yourself with people who can challenge your process, not just the ones who agree with your conclusion. So would anybody here like to follow up with what I just read here on that?
I think that sounds great. And I think it sounds exactly like how to think like a philosopher. And the reason this is what my claim earlier, the reason that I say that is because, I mean, that's not in any way to say anything against science. Good scientists do that exactly. It's just that everybody, when they're thinking well and clearly does that, whether they're reasoning about things that are science or whether they're reasoning about morality or whether they're reasoning about, you know, God, philosophy, religion, that kind of stuff. So for me then, what scientists do really well is applying those same kinds of everything he said, you know, self-criticism, humility, looking for things to challenge you, but sort of applied more directly to then the kinds of questions that scientists are, you know, best equipped to answer.
I like that quote a lot too, and it inspired, actually, it's an activity I did in my comm classes just last week as we started reading the book. But what I had to do is take a persuasive stance on any topic, and they had to say, you know, they had to write down what their stance was, but then they had to list all the reasons why they could be wrong. And I just like that way of thinking because it gets us out of that. I have to defend my idea. I have to be right. And in fact, what I like so much is this encouragement of acknowledge when you don't know something. If you don't know, say you don't know. And then start asking the questions that will help you. I like the idea of challenge your conclusion. we want to be challenged in our conclusions. And that's, if you're not thinking that way, if you're just celebrating that, maybe I got to my conclusion, thank goodness I was right all along. Well, you're not thinking like a scientist, you're thinking like like a human being with an ego, which is all of us, but we're trying to add another layer to that.
I would say scientists always didn't always think that way either. Francis Bacon was one of the first ones to come up with this idea that we're not going to shoehorn the evidence into a preconceived thesis. And I try to teach that skill with my students as well, particularly when they're doing research papers. That, you know, sometimes I'll get a student who comes up and says, "Oh my gosh, I need to switch my side. I'm so sorry." And I said, "No, you got it. That's exactly what you were supposed to do." Rather than use what one Neil Brown calls weak sense critical thinking. I think it's similar to what Aaron was saying, where you've got your answer and now you find only the pieces of information that fit and conform to that. So having that ability to say, "Oh, I blew that one. You know, I guess I am gonna have to think again on that."
Agreed. You got to take your emotions completely out of the science realm. We have 2 doctors up here too. You guys have probably defended dissertations. Brutal process. It's heartening, to say the least. Basically, you decide, I'm going to go ahead and research a certain topic. And what you're doing is you're discovering something that no one else has ever discovered in the history of mankind. You bring your findings forward to a panel of other doctors, and they proceed to tear down your entire research, cast doubt on you, disprove things, and you'll get your doctorate. And ultimately, after they're done ripping you apart, there's a little morsel of something they didn't realize that actually turns out to be not so much provable. It's a small morsel, but it's just a tiny step forward in discovering the absolute truth. If your emotions are in there, it's a painful process. And that's how science works. It's a tool to discover what's already out there, but unknown. You need that humility.
Okay, next question. How do you encourage your students in your classes or discipline to think like a scientist? We'll start down at the other end this time. So Ray, you're first this time.
Yes, it's a very painful process. It's tough to do too. My motto in the classroom is cry in the dojo, laugh on the battlefield. So during class, I'm going to be pointing out ways in which, well, you didn't get that one correct because you forgot about this piece. So students don't like being wrong. Oh, the answer is 16. Sorry, it's actually 12. When that happens publicly, it hurts. But the benefit is, hey, you were wrong about something. You're embarrassed. Now, next time, do better. So on the exam, it's like, oh, I made that same mistake back then. I'm not going to make it a second time. Now the exam becomes a little bit easier. I'm trying to teach them to embrace the mistakes, but it's not always a very pleasant experience for the students.
One way I think we do it indirectly in philosophy is helping students think about the different kinds of questions that we humans find ourselves asking and the different kinds of tools that we can use to answer that question. So if you want to know whether or not, vaccine is effective or not, you probably don't need to come to my class. I mean, you probably need to follow the data, see what comes about. But if you know whether or not whether people ought to be required to take certain kinds of vaccines, well, now we've got a question that science isn't really directly equipped to answer. Because now we have to talk about things like values and about, if we're talking about coercive kinds of oughts, about the limits of government authority, about what legitimates a particular coercive just in the general sense of what you're sort of legally required to do. But of course, we also need to ask moral questions about that. Suppose, whether or not the government does or doesn't coerce it, are there moral reasons why you should get a vaccine, to have to protect others? Well, again, science isn't really equipped directly to answer that question. Science can furnish us a lot of important data about, effectiveness rates and uptake and those kinds of things. So one of the things I think we do, I hope that we do, at least in philosophy, is sort of indirectly helping students think about, well, if this is the question that I want to answer, what are the kinds of intellectual reasoning tools that I need? What kinds of data do I need to go find? But then how do I reason carefully about it? So we don't teach them to think like a scientist in a narrow sense, but we do teach them how to think well generally about all kinds of different kinds of questions. How those apply.
Yeah, there's a lot to this, and there's a lot more than meets the surface, that you just see on the surface, right? So in a communication class, you might say something like, oh, I feel like I did really good on that speech. Or if you're going for a job interview, oh, I feel like I interviewed really well. And you might ask, why? Why did you do well on that speech? Why do you think you did well? Or why do you think you interviewed well? I don't know. I mean, I just felt good. Well, we've got to isolate that feeling and we've got to quantify it. And that is communication meeting science. So I'd like to tell you maybe two of my experiences as a student myself. My very first comm class was here at ICC. And I had, he's now passed away, but Professor Ron Howell had his COM 110 students do a survey, an interview project. It was one of the most unique things I ever did. And I'll make a long story super short, but it was essentially, we had to come up with a fake survey people, whatever you want about your attitudes on the ICC cafeteria or something, it doesn't matter. But what you were really testing is how close you could get to them while you interviewed them. Something you certainly wouldn't be doing in COVID time, right? I was a student here 20 plus years ago. It was really cool. And what you were doing though, is you had a whole team who were writing down observations. And you had, of course, you had to make a thesis. You had to have a hypothesis that says, if I dress formally, can I get closer than if I'm informal? Or if I wear a certain color, or if I wear perfume, or if I spike my hair, how does that change how people react to it? And so communication is trying to quantify a feeling at times. And that's so cool. You know, and I love doing that and trying to figure out, you can't just say, I feel like I'm doing a good job, or I feel like I know what I'm talking about. Here's the evidence. Here's the research that says good eye contact will improve the perception that others have of your confidence. And if you have a higher perception of confidence, you're more likely to get the job. But the science part of it says, well, here's how we know that. Here's where the research came from. Here's how this, you know, here, let's back that up, right? That was my first comm experience. My last comm experience when I was in graduate school and defending a master's thesis, I took on a fun project where it was, can late night entertainment, satirical humor, and parodies of political pieces actually influence and change minds? It's a complicated process. And I remember getting together surveys of community members in Metamora. I was teaching at Metamora High School at the time. And we bring in these community members and we play a clip on Fox News, play a clip on MSNBC, and then I play a Jon Stewart Daily Show clip or a fun SNL clip. And we did all these surveys. Did their minds change? And the point is that sometimes I like to say, yeah, good humor, good satire can change minds, right? And get you to think differently about the world. But that's just a feeling. So communication meeting science, I think the whole reason why I have a master's of science in communication is because I learned how to quantify that, research it, and prove whether it was statistically significant or not. Going through that process, you would never think being a comm major, I would have to learn statistics and computer programs to analyze the statistical significance of my studies, but you do. And that is communication meeting science. And so when I go to my intro students and I'm just like, I know we're taking on some basic stuff here, basic concepts, maybe about persuasion and how people feel about things, but I always want you thinking like a scientist. And that's, again, just, I love this book. It ties in so perfectly with everything that we do, but that really is it in a nutshell. I encourage students in my classes to focus on the process of how they think and how that influences communication. And it's the process that's the most important, I think, more than what they actually think.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. When I'm teaching literature, teaching film, the first thing I explain to students is there's not one right answer, right? Every single person in this room could approach that document or that film in highly different ways. Now, in terms of scientific method and the humanities, there's something now called digital humanities. Actually started in 1951, believe it or not. Big mainframe computers that probably as big as this room, and punch cards and so forth. And they were trying to do what's called a concordance, which is a list of all the words that a particular author uses. Flash forward to today, our computers are much smaller and in our phones and so forth, and there's much more powerful software that would take a book like this and it would break it down. How many times is think used in this book? and so forth and so on. Now that can get you certain things. It can get you very quantified, data on someone's prose style, for example, how complicated their style is and so forth. What it can't really do for you though, and this is one of the things that I try to encourage in my students, is to explain, okay, now what do all these lists of words mean? And while people in the humanities, literary critics might not call it the scientific method, they've been doing this for centuries, because essentially it's like a mini experiment, right? You'll read a novel and you'll come to some kind of mental explanation. Other people might come up with same explanations. You write it down, and pretty soon we'll get some kind of consensus. We'll get some kind of pattern going. What will happen though, when you read a book and you say, I don't believe that, I think it's something else. Well, then you're testing that original hypothesis, and maybe you've got different evidence. Maybe you read a letter from the writer, or maybe you happen to know about a certain disease or a certain kind of technology that was in use in the Middle Ages, and you say, oh, this is actually a metaphor for that. No one saw that before, but I saw it, right? And so then you put your interpretation on using evidence, using words from the document, and then words from your outside sources. And then you put it out there in the world, and then some other reader will say, I find that is very compelling, and I think I'm going to change my mind. Or they might think, that is such a stretched out interpretation. You know, of course, that this person was notorious for lying in his letters, and there are 18 other letters that this author wrote that say the opposite, right? And so it's that same kind of testing the experiment, I suppose, that goes on.
Okay, what do you see as a drawback of thinking like a scientist? So I'm going to start with Joe this time on this one.
When I thought about this question in terms of what's a drawback to thinking like a scientist, it's sort of the extremes to me that I worry about, the overconfidence or the too open-minded, and you're willing to examine every single piece, point of view there is. And it's the extremes that to me are the drawbacks, but also just to be very direct and honest. I think what scared me over the last couple of years would get into this mentality with conversations with my friends and family, and I would say, look, we all have different views on the pandemic and vaccines and 100 other issues, right? And to a point where I'm saying, but I'm not going to tolerate a point of view that can't be backed up with some evidence. And that evidence needs to come from a credible place. So I'd like to even step to the side and say, can we examine credibility? Can we run the crap test? Go through credibility, reliability, the author, the purpose of the particular sources. But the problem with that is simple. It alienates people. You have arguments and conflicts. You might even lose a relationship with a friend or a family member because of it. Maybe because of an unwillingness to listen to a point of view based on a feeling. And that's where I struggle, because there's only so much tolerance I'm going to have for that feeling if it can't be backed up by something. That's a drawback. And so then, I'm lucky to have a subject to turn to and say, all right, well, how do I communicate and interact with individuals that don't share my particular points of view? And that's just as important to me as anything else we're talking about, just a different subject. But that to me is definitely a drawback.
Aaron?
Well, I don't know if it's exactly a problem with thinking like a scientist per se, but it's rather that sometimes the very good things that we learn from science can cause us to overlook or miss some of the key questions that are both in the background and the foreground. So for example, perhaps the social sciences can give us good evidence, good data about certain ways of reconfiguring the workplace such that it will increase productivity and efficiency, with hopefully the result that it will increase profits, right? And that might well be true. But what sort of is baked into that are some really important questions about are productivity and efficiency the values that we should be aiming at? Is increasing profits, why is that a good thing, right? Maybe it is a good thing, but why? And those are the kinds of questions that, again, I think science is not directly equipped to answer. Science can furnish us relevant data, right? But it's not equipped to answer that. So, and by the way, I think that scientists are well aware of that, right? I mean, responsible scientists are well aware of the promise and the power, but also the limitations of what they're doing. Sometimes when it gets out into the news or the kind of popular area, a lot of those nuances get lost. So I suppose I guess that's my way of responding to that. Even when we learn great things from science, we just got to be careful that we're not overlooking what some of those sort of fundamental questions are behind the scenes.
Right?
Yeah, I'll go. There are no weaknesses to thinking like a scientist. There are none. As an advocate for science, I can confidently say that, but there are problems that will pop up. For example, indecisiveness, overthinking. That's one of the weaknesses you can't have by thinking too much like a scientist. You guys baseball fans? I heard that if you're playing professional baseball and you're up at bat, you have 0.4 seconds to decide whether or not you want to swing at that ball. The batter's watching carefully. What did the pitcher's hands look like? How's the ball spinning? How fast is it going towards me? What's the curvature? They got to make all those decisions in 0.4 seconds before they take a swing at the ball, or not take a swing, or duck before it hits in the head. That's how it works. If you're doing too much science and analyzing that ball, you'll miss your chance. You might get your head knocked off. That's one thing that can happen. But my response to that is think like a scientist faster. Beat that 0.4 second timeline. So I see no weaknesses. Well, there is one. As a scientist, I don't care about hurting people's feelings. I don't care about emotions. I don't care about being alone. In fact, it's fantastic. I go home and I'm at peace. And all I have are 2 cats. And there's no emotional creatures bothering me whatsoever. It's very, very peaceful. Unfortunately, that comes at a cost for some people. There's things like love. There's things like hatred. There's things like happiness. And if you use science, you can actually break it down and show, oh, they're just chemical reactions in the brain, certain synapses firing. It can all be broken down into that. Sadly, science cannot experience that. It's a shame. Love can be explained through science, but what's it like to be in love? What's it like to go through hatred? What's it like to experience happiness? Science has nothing on that one. The actual experience of going through those things, science has nothing on that one there, which is one weakness that's in place for that. So going on vacation, you can tell me everything that's in the water, everything that's in the land, the history, the culture, where it's heading. But what's it like to actually put your feet in the sand? What's it like to actually fly over there, see the sights, interact with the people? Science has nothing on that piece. So there's one thing that science can't do, and I think that's its only oversight. Aside from that, we need more science. That's my honest opinion.
James?
Yeah, I think it's more either a misapplication of the scientific method. Aaron alluded to that in the popular press. I recall something when I was a kid, that my grandmother said to me that she had 4 kids. And for each of those 4 kids, the doctors were relying on the most recent research about when and where and whether to give the child meat, right? And each kid, the same doctor said different times, right? So that, I guess, if we're sort of trying to pinpoint an action based on science, well, we need a meta study, don't we? We can't just rely on a single study. I think also when science becomes untethered from ethics, we can see all sorts of interesting things. So there, have been, innumerable animal studies on live animals, and this is late 1700s, and no anesthetic, right? The animals just sort of tied down and worked on. Yeah, they're learning all sorts of stuff, but I think obviously there's an application of when we should be doing that. What kind of rules do we need in place? Unfortunately, now we're evolving, and you're not going to find, hopefully, American scientists anyway, doing that to animals, at least above board. People did that to humans as well, obviously, in Nazi Germany. So that's one. The second is what Ray brought up about reducing something like love to pheromones and, you know, chemical reactions, right? That mystery of life. And I think that's also a downside of those digital humanities I was talking about. Word counting. Well, all right, you take your favorite novel, your favorite film, and you reduce it to a scatter point graph. It's just not the same as experiencing those emotions and the depth of feeling. So yeah, we can say what it is, but maybe we need a little more mystery sometimes.
Just listening to all these wonderful answers here, one of the things that I just keep popping, and it keeps popping into my head from time to time, and it's not really a drawback per se, but I think it's just a way of human nature, is the fact that we're not very good at letting people change their minds. We're very much like, well, you said that 3 years ago, and now you're saying something totally different.
You're a flip-flopper.
You're a flip-flopper. Yeah, exactly. And we're just not good at allowing for us to learn and come up with new ways of thinking to change our minds and things like that.
I like that. Just use Grant's language when he talks about preachers and politicians, and on that mode being one of the things that makes you a great preacher or a great politician is staying true to your values and your convictions and not changing your mind, because we can trust you. But a scientist better darn well change their mind when evidence comes about. But that's also a drawback when you have people in the past who are like, oh, but yeah, a couple years ago you were recommending this, the doctors were, and now they're saying this, and how do you trust what? And that, so that confusion can be a drawback, yeah.
Okay, our last question here for today. How can schools, both K-12 and colleges or universities, do a better job of thinking again? And let's see, who did not? I think Aaron gets to start with this one. And he's like, no. If you'd like to pass, you can.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a good answer to that, partly because I think that maybe there are some broader kinds of cultural things that are feeding into what we think is important about, you know, K through 12 education. So maybe I'll just answer it this way. I'll give the standard kind of humanities liberal arts answer here. Obviously, people need jobs, and I think it's great that we at ICC and other places train people for the technical skills they need to do their work. Of course, we have to do that, right? But I mean, if anything, our recent political climate suggests that we also need a lot of help in being good citizens and how to think well about history, how to think well about all kinds of things. So in a sense, this is like not the answer to the question that you're really asking here, but I guess what I need to say is, I do think that helping everyone think more like a scientist might actually include helping everyone think better about everything. I mean, because the better you are at being able to put those scientific questions in context, both cultural and historical and philosophical, my hope, I guess, is, you know, the better you'll be at being able to, you have a better shot at being able to discern credible from from the lack of credible sources.
Like credibility.
Yeah, lack of credible sources. The better you'll be at, I mean, I think that we should trust science and scientists, but what that means is we should trust the process that they're using to critique themselves and get better. I do think we should probably not always trust reporting about science, right? Well, again, the more you're sort of have gotten the broad, hopefully the more liberal arts, the humanities approaches, you sort of have your ear attuned to that, the way in which even people of goodwill, right, can perhaps misrepresent things or misunderstand things. So anyway, that's not really much of an answer to your question, except what I hope is the broader our education is, actually the better we're prepared to be able to think like science.
Right?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. Before I discovered the wonderful world of education, I used to work for a Fortune 100 company. And after about the first 6 months, they decided, hey, we want some people that are close to college age to go back to universities and help us hire new recruits. Okay, great, volunteered for it, went to a college, met with some students at a job fair, took home a bunch of resumes, and I picked my top 10. And to my dismay, the manager picked 3 that I said I liked and said, these 3 gotta go. I asked why, and he said, it's their GPAs. Yeah, they're 4.0s, what's wrong with that? And he said, we don't hire 4.0s here. Why not? Simple. Students that had a 4.0 that we tend to notice, they don't do well with mistakes. Their entire college career, they've gotten everything right, and we're afraid that the first day on the job, when we tell them, you messed that up, they'll freak out, they won't be able to take it, we gotta go and hire somebody else. The range we like is no higher than a 3.8. The book also mentions something about that as well, about 4.0 students. They're programmed to just do exactly what they're told, no critical thinking, nothing whatsoever. And unfortunately, the reason why it's like that boils back down to this level of where we train these young adults into becoming professionals. We punish people for being wrong. Elementary schools, K through 12 especially, they punish you for being wrong, not outright even, but they have recess classroom time. Did you hear what John said in science today? I can't believe he said that. There's pressure to be right all around. What schools have to start doing is finding out who's wrong. Well, they're already good at that. Wrong answer and telling them to fix their mistakes, because being wrong is an educational opportunity. It's painful, but it's an educational opportunity. Once we can learn it's okay to be wrong, revise our thinking, we'll become better thinkers. And that's what the world really needs right now.
James?
Well, one thing about this debate is it's not the first time we've heard this broken schools narrative. In fact, when I was in elementary school, it was waging on with the so-called new math. Right now, right, it's raging on about what's being taught in the curriculum. Go back further, John Dewey was talking about how 19th century people were talking about how crappy our schools were and so forth and so on, all the way back to William Bradford talking about kids these days in the Puritan era. So I think there's a certain amount of alarmism on the one hand. Secondly, I think it's a mistake to think about us having one system, right? Even if there are state outcomes and so forth, each individual teacher is interpreting those outcomes differently, that curriculum differently. So I think we have to, first of all, don't think of it as a single system, right? Part of that, though, comes down to funding, and the way we do funding in American high schools, grammar schools, in particular, is location-based and tax-based. And I think if you really want to shake things up, let's see what schools can do to attract better teachers, to get more equipment and so forth, if everybody's got the same amount of money to play with, right? Rather than a school having to depend, hopefully, on getting grants from the federal government and so forth. Well, what happens if that school in the 100% white suburb has the same exact amount of money as a school that's 100% Black students, and I think that would be a game changer.
100% agree. When I look at the problems or within colleges and universities and K-12, I just think about tradition and stability. I think it's human nature to not want to change, and that's the first thing that we come across. So teachers, look at how they've been taught. Well, how was I taught this 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago? I can't remember. How was it's always been done that way? I gave an example in class today about year-round schooling. Like, well, what if the data suggests that year-round schooling actually has much better results than having all summers off. Shouldn't we change and follow the data? Oh, don't you take away my summers, right? And you know, the Peoria Public Schools even changed their schedule this year. I think they started August 3rd. I remember those buses were picking up students very early. And on the news articles, parents complaining about it. And I don't have an answer. I didn't go into that much detail, but it was like, oh my gosh, here's a change. And oh, I don't want to change. I don't even want to think about if it could be better. It's like our first reaction to the new website. No one likes something new. It's like, where is this and where's that at? It takes time to go through things and to relearn. You have to relearn. Learning's hard. Relearning's harder. I really think so, because you have to teach yourself all over again how to do something. Isn't that, I mean, that's just the absolute truth. So for me, I look at the it's always been done this way argument, whether that's a test. Should you be able to collaborate with others on your tests? I mean, when I work on something for curriculum, I go to my colleagues and I say, what do you think about this? Did I do this okay? Before I submit it, but I don't get to do that in some classrooms, right? Where it's just me completely isolated and independent. But collaboration is how the real world works. I get to discuss these ideas and these answers with others. There's not a perfect solution. I'm not saying one way is better than another, but all of this depends on the subject and the situation and so many different issues. So I think the theme of the book, of course, is when we have these big ideas, maybe changing from a 16-week to more 8-week classes. And people are like, oh my gosh, I can't teach that many 8-week classes, or our students won't sign up for them. Let's think again about that, right? Are there better results possibly if we went that particular route? I'll give you an easy one in my subject that we're going back and forth about in communication, but when we first started doing online communication classes, you had to have an audience of 8. If you were going to record a speech at home and take a comm class online, you had to recruit 8 people. Then COVID hit and they got away. You didn't have to have anybody. And then this semester we reinstated it, and the powers that be said we have to have 6. And in my mind immediately went to, where's the research that said 8 is public and 6 is public? But I did speeches for 2 years during the pandemic. Are none of those the same value? Is that what you would tell me? And I would want to question all of that. But again, think about the fallacy of tradition. Oh, but you can't do a speech without a lot of people there. And oh, no, don't you dare talk to me about these other Zoom. What is that? I have no idea. You know, we have to relearn these things, and it's just a very hard thing to do. And that's where I think we have trouble is and it's a compliment in the book too, but we feel, and rightly so, we know what we're talking about. But we also need to know that we can probably be better too.
Climbing off of Mount Stupid is painful.
Yeah. So those are all the questions I have, and we've taken approximately 45 minutes here. Does anybody here have any questions or anything to say, or any comments that they'd like to add? And if there's anybody on Zoom that would like to, you can either add it through the chat, or you can turn on your microphone as far as that goes too. Does anybody have anything to say? Nobody? Everybody's really quiet because they were awed with your excellence.
I'll ask the question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying, Ray. You said there was no fault with the scientific method.
Oh, no fault with science. I am biased. As a scientist, I believe all science is perfect, and we need more of it.
Okay, a couple follow-ups to that. To think about, everyone in here is finite and imperfect, so can that which is finite and imperfect come up with something that is perfect? But furthermore, in the scientific method, and I teach it in my classes when I do epistemology, and I've also served on IRBs, which are institutional review boards that were tasked with human subject research, which uses the scientific method. And science is the science does, but the flaw of the scientific method would be it cannot take into account sentient beings. And that is the job of ethics, which doesn't necessarily fall under science. So I'd like your response to that critique of science that I just offered.
Sentient beings? It can't take into account sentient beings, you're saying?
Right, science, James picked up on that a little bit, but, when I do medical ethics, I talk about medical research and all that happened during the Holocaust. And you said, this, no compassion, or I forget how you said it, no understanding and so forth. And so that's what I'm saying.
crossing
And-
over it. He keeps telling me to get back. Well, at this point in time, a crowd's forming, so I'm back with the crowd. And he's finally like, get back, you know, and he's on the radio for backup. And I said, officer, I am at a reasonable distance.
Right, so, you know, science is gonna only seek the scientific method and the scientific goals. But when humans are involved as animals, human animals, we have to take into account sentientism. And so the scientific method doesn't really, and there's no place for that in the scientific method in its pure form. And I'll leave it at that. I have more, but I'll just leave it at that. So to me, that would be a fault of the scientific method. And so, and scientists can even, when you read what the Nazis did, you can even see how some of the, what they were after. And one of the experiments that they've used is questionable, should we cite their data or not? And there's big debates over some of that came out of those experiments. And so if you're just talking about, you know, maybe physics or something, sure. But there's more to science than just that aspect of the natural sciences, especially in human sciences and behaviors and all that. And so to me, and this is something I've dealt with a long time when I teach, is it cannot take into account that aspect, and it's a shortcoming in the methodology. So that's just something to throw out there and see what you would think about that challenge to the scientific method.
Yes, and that involves the emotional part of it.
What involves more than emotion?
Well, yeah, if you're experimenting on humans,
That's not emotion, though.
It's empathy, isn't it?
Partly, but it's ethics of right and wrong. Emotions are neither right or wrong.
I've got the solution to this problem.
Yeah,
Are you ready?
yeah, help me out here.
Let's just go, we'll go back to the medieval model of the ordering of the disciplines. Now, you've got, theology is gonna be at the top, might not like that, but then we'll go with philosophy. And then the sciences below that, and here's why. Because there is a sense in which the sciences can be perfect insofar as they are fully actualizing what it is that they're good at, just so long as they are properly ordered towards the end that are genuinely good, and so far as they are subordinate to moral norms. So as long as philosophy is the higher order knowledge, then I think we're good. Does that work?
I think I agree. The thing I was thinking about too is the issue that's hot right now is abortion. When does life begin? That's the controversial one right now. And so
Right.
we've all agreed that at a 9-month mark, you probably shouldn't do it. It's not ethical anymore. But then it's like, okay, well, let's bring it back. What about that first trimester? And now we have to use science. How many cells are inside of it? But then people say, well, it's the potential to have life. And so then science comes back and says, well, hold on a minute, potential for life. If you really want to go back that far, what about sperm and eggs? A lot of that is wasted every day too. Should we be born for that as well? So right there, science can't pinpoint anything. And then who's to say at
Right.
that 3-month mark, that's the moment where it's actually a life, because every pregnancy is different. And there's just not enough time or effort possible to make sure there's an actual answer. So Aaron, yeah, I do agree with that.
Yeah,
ethics
Aquinas
up there
even dealt with
has to
that.
guide.
And you can't have science without philosophy, so I would say it would help. I mean, I could, of course, but.
But what do you do
This
with
helps.
it? That part is.
I think there's a self-correcting aspect to the scientific method. I remember reading Stephen Jay Gould, if any of you have read him, The Mismeasure of Man and so forth, and using science and looking at the data and not accounting for one's own prejudices, and in this case against women and people of color. The premise was that the larger the skull, the more intelligent the person, right? And just so happened that according to their data, it was white men who were at the top of the scale, and then we worked down. But what Gould does in his writings is shows how the scientific method, one rebel scientist sort of pushing against all those other scientists and saying, wait a minute, I think you're making an assumption here, and challenging that. So I think but the problem with it is that the scientific method can take decades, centuries, millennia to come up with that self-correcting mechanism that fits that ethical paradigm you're talking about. I mean, we don't do what what John Hunter, he was the surgeon I was referring to, does with live animals now. At least
We
not,
should.
not out in the public and the light of day on your research grant. You're not saying, oh, I'm gonna, you know, but that took a long time. I mean, really, I mean, Peter Singer is talking about this in the 70s, 1970s.
Yeah.
So we go from the 1790s to the 1970s before it starts becoming an issue. And then really not till the 80s before people start protesting PETA and other organizations and finally get some traction on it. So it can take a long, long time. So that can be a positive, but I think it can be a negative too, because the change is sometimes very, very slow.
So, and what I'm hearing you say is there's a social aspect to the scientific method, that it's not just this pristine, independent, objective methodology, but there's a certain social aspect to it.
Well, I think that's it. That's what Gould points out
Yeah.
pretty clearly in his work, and not just that, but lots of essays that he did. That our biases are there. We see this presently in something like climate change, where you can have, you know, one group of scientists saying this and another group of scientists maybe challenging the vast preponderance of experiments and so forth. But what Gould is pointing out is that just because the bigger group says it's this, well, sometimes it's that one person. So, yeah.
And I'll clarify my position. What I'm seeing in the world right now is we're not arguing against different philosophies that much anymore. That part is kind of shrunken since the whole COVID thing went down. Now we're arguing over which facts are true. And that's beginning to be a problem. If we have more science, we'll know that these facts are universal, and then we can move on to more philosophical debates like that.
Old school of thought that asks, does science really give us truth or knowledge? You're using, as Hume's critique is, you're using induction to prove induction, or inductive reasoning. So there's several assumptions that I don't want to get into, but several assumptions just in that statement that you made right there.
I have math on my side, and that one cannot be debated.
Yeah, I can, and I have a math problem to prove that very point. No.
I think we're gonna have
We
to
gotta-
take
we
a
gotta
time
talk.
out on this at this point. You guys can take care of this in the faculty lounge at some
I
point.
want to know about that math problem.
So at this point, it's almost 3 o'clock, so I want to stop this here today. There is a feedback form for you to fill out in person that we've been sending out for those of you in virtual to fill it out and chat. There was a form to fill out there. I'd like to thank our panelists for an enlightening discussion. This has been really great. I appreciate it. Let's all give them a round of applause. I will also let you guys know that we do have another program coming up on November 1st at noon. It's called Fault Lines. If you've read the book, think again, there's a section that he talks about any of you like baseball people, anything like that. Is it against the fans, the Red Sox to root for the Yankees, or is the Yankees to root for the
Not
Red Sox?
necessarily to root for them, but to not want to beat them up.
Not going to beat them up. Okay, well, close enough. But we decided to play off of that. We're going to do a program on the history of sports rivalries. So that'll be November 1st at noon. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and please fill out that feedback form. And you're free to go.